to Keepin the Comic, the channel that remembers a time before everyone had a smartphone, where the only people we cared about were the ones that were on Saturday morning cartoons. Paying a closer look to X-Men 97, I can boldly say the show has once again cracked the X-Men formula to make successful X-Men content because it focuses on what an X-Men show should focus on, the X-Men, and not just one character. Yep, I'm talking about you, Wolverine. So we're going to be talking about why this formula is vital for the reintroduction of the X-Men into the big screen, as well as future Marvel projects. Now, it's not far-fetched to say that X-Men 97 is truly killing it right now. With the X-Men 97 success and Deadpool and Wolverine coming out in July, I think the MCU is finally getting back on its feet. But when I really looked at the show, I realized that there are three core things that X-Men 97 does with its characters that make the show a complete banger. First of which is the isolation from the crowd. I think X-Men 97 killed it by actually isolating more X-Men characters and focusing on them rather than just talking about Wolverine again. I love Hugh Jackman as Wolverine, but over the past 2 decades, it's starting to feel like Wolverine is the only important X-Men. Like he's the individual that defines the X-Men. It's either him or Charles Xavier or even Magneto, while every other X-Men rarely gets talked about and their stories get relegated to the sidelines. These unspoken characters and their stories are what's important about the X-Men, and it's the reason why it feels like the X-Men are always missing something when they get shown on the big screen. So isolating them and having the audience actually falling in love with more X-Men characters individually was a real breath of fresh air. I mean, look at what they did to Cyclops. Back in the day with the Fox original trilogy, not many of us liked Cyclops. All he was a gene lover and a Wolverine rival, and that's pretty much it. There was no real depth to him. So in all honesty, most viewers didn't really care when he died in The Last Stand. It was more like, oh well, I guess that happened. And yet in X-Men 97, something inside of me snapped. Maybe it's because I have 4 children for myself, but when I saw this man struggling with the dilemma of losing his child, or struggling with the role as a leader in the absence of Charles Xavier, and then struggling with the confusion of having 2 genes in his life, and then struggling with the Genosha genocide. That's a whole lot of struggling going on with Cyclops, but that's what adds depth to these characters. Cyclops is by the books, altruistic, and perceived as a Boy Scout kind of character, and X-Men 97 put situations in his face that force him to question his ideals, his emotions, and his mental state until he just snaps.
Because I have to stomach your questions and prove that I'm a person.
But this doesn't take away the fact that he's still a good guy. He's just a good guy who's really going through it. I had no idea that this level of depth could actually emerge from a character like him based on what we saw in the most recent movies. And it's the same thing with Storm. I mean, having her deal with losing her abilities, something that's an integral part of her identity, having her fall in love with Forge, the man who is kind of responsible for her setbacks, and then having the adversary feast on her fears and watching her rise above her limitations and come back even stronger with a complete glow up, might I add. To me, that's just crazy. Also, we can talk about the costumes in the X-Men 97 show. There is something the movies are consistently missing out on, eliminating the need for brightly colored costumes for the X-Men because they feel it's too cheesy or maybe geeky. X-Men 97 is unapologetic about using the comic accurate costumes of these characters, something that the Deadpool and Wolverine movie is going to be doing as well. And as you can see with the love it's all getting from the fans, this system works. Every single character feels like they can have their own spin-off show. We wouldn't even be mad at it. I mean, sign me up for a Storm spin-off series. Hell, give me a Professor X and the Shi'ar Empire and call it Keeping Up with the Kardashians. I'm sorry, I just had to. The stories are isolated and yet it all ties together interestingly. I love the fact that the show is willing to breathe life into lesser explored characters in more ways than once. While they're in the midst of their troubles and adventures, they have to come together to face this looming threat. And that's the isolation with the crowd element I'm talking about, because the characters aren't just isolated, they still have the team and the family that they need to unite with to face the overarching and more sinister plots. See what I did there? Now, next is the drama and dynamics between the characters. This is something I personally found completely mesmerizing. Look at Magneto and Rogue. Where has that relationship been hiding? Also, ew. And then they added my boy Gambit into the mix. It's like a soap opera, but you know, with superpowers and explosions and robots that shoot lasers out of their eyes. The Madeline Pryor, Jean, and Cyclops story I mentioned earlier is the same way. It's almost like there's just something always standing in the way of these characters from finding happiness. And just when they're close to figuring things out, boom, your son gets hit with a virus. A group of racial militants try to kill you. Or a demon from hell doesn't want you to fly. And also those robots with the lasers try to unalive your entire race. I mean, take Take Professor X, for example. He was this close to convincing the council to allow him to marry Lilandra. And yet, as he was about to do that, he gets a whiff of what's happening on Earth, and he has to return while abandoning the woman that he loves. It is these aspects of the stories that speak to me, these dramatic moments that raise the stakes and offer a new level of depth to an already deep and nuanced storyline. And this ends up playing out into the fight scenes and the fight sequences of the series, making the battles between these characters even more meaningful and worthwhile, because now I understand what these guys are dealing with and why they're fighting so hard and what this all means to them. That's why I felt it deep to my core when Magneto sacrificed himself to save Rogue, or when Gambit also then sacrificed himself to save Rogue, or when Xavier sacrificed his relationship for his team, and when Jubilee sacrificed being a kid for growing up. Although, to be fair, that last one pales in comparison to the others, but you get my point. The implications of the drama cannot be overemphasized, and I think X-Men 97 really hit the nail on the head with it. Also, if you like to hit things just like the show, then you should hit that subscribe button and help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers before the YouTube algorithm gets all sinister with us. And last but certainly not least here is the relatability. I think one of the core tenets that fans of X-Men have always enjoyed is the sheer relatability of the characters. X-Men storylines have always had the tendency of speaking to a lot of people and having them go, yeah, that's just like me. The X-Men have always been about bringing light and showcasing the beauty of those who are marginalized and oppressed despite their abilities, and yet they always manage to choose good and follow a righteous path even with all the biases thrown at them. This is deeper than comics. This is deeper than flashy colors, powers, and cool theme songs. The X-Men have always been the succinct representation of marginalized groups and individuals who are hated and discriminated against just because they are different. So anyone who has ever felt alone, hated, and unwanted can find solace in the X-Men. These kinds of stories speak to those of us who knew how hard it was growing up, especially as teenagers and dealing with our need for acceptance and yet not really finding a lot of it. It's probably why mutant abilities mostly show up when mutants are in their teenage years, because these ages and upwards are the show's ideal demographic, and it's ironically the ages when humans start to struggle existentially. These stories are familiar to us, and so are their struggles, and that's what X-Men 97 has thrown us into. It's always been ironic to me that mutants who are supposed to be the next step in human evolution are treated like lesser beings. Even the Shi'ar calls Xavier a lesser version of humans. Like, what? And then Xavier goes ahead to literally school these some bitches.
Here, class is now in session.
And I think that's something fundamental about the X-Men. It's about giving a voice to individuals who are being silenced and oppressed, letting them know that it's okay to be themselves. It's okay to be different, that there are people that are going through it, yet they still manage to choose good. It's the idea of finding a family and making life work, despite the obvious differences. But that's not all the relatable elements of X-Men 97. The show actually takes a stand for civil rights and equality as well. It's willing to bring that conversation to the forefront. And it's not even doing it in a preachy or patronizing way, like making the audience feel like they're monsters or hateful bigots. Rather, it gives us a mirror of society and the horrors that exist when discrimination and subjugation go too far, forcing the audience to go, yeah, this can actually happen. We have to change. I think what's scary about it is the fact that the show takes its stand unapologetically about discrimination, and it doesn't try to play both sides or risk not offending anyone. The MCU not only needs to adopt the system for X-Men projects, but for the MCU projects as well, especially for movies or shows with political affiliations. Take Falcon and the Winter Soldier, for example. It was a political thriller that was supposed to tackle the effects of the blip on the world, especially politically. Yet it didn't take a definite stand on things. It felt like the show was playing both sides, that the flag smashers were bad, but then they were also good, and the government was good, but also bad. Like, what's your point here? And then Sam just comes out in the end and tells everyone?
You've got to do better, Senator.
Like, what the hell does that even mean? No, Marvel, you gotta do better from now on. Take a good stance on your projects as you did with X-Men 97. For example, episode 2 invokes imagery from January 6th, with protesters storming the UN building like they did in real life at Capitol Hill. And then it beautifully shows what the consequences of that are. Straight up mayhem. I love the fact that the show isn't afraid to go there. It isn't afraid to point out the bigotry that exists in the human race, something that has been somewhat disguised with tolerance and wokeness in today's current climate. So both politically and on a much more personal level, the show is heavily relatable, giving us the truest adaptation of X-Men stories we've seen in a very long time. And the MCU needs to learn from it. This is what the MCU should be like on the big screen. This shouldn't just be about Wolverine. This should be, as the name implies, about the X-Men, about their individual lives, and how it all ties to the team, the drama that exists within all of that, and also the relatable appeal that the X-Men and their stories have. So let me know what you think about it. How are you loving the series so far? And what are your thoughts on how the X-Men should be in the MCU? Be sure to check out our other videos here on the X-Men on this channel. And as always, thanks so much for kicking it with Keepin' It Comic. Bye.